It was a cold and rainy evening. Tiny drops of rain tapped softly against the little wooden windows of Rocco's cabin. Tap, tap, tap. Outside, the forest swayed gently beneath the wind. Tall pine trees whispered quietly in the darkness, while little puddles shimmered beneath the silver moonlight. Inside the cabin, everything felt warm. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting tiny golden shadows across the wooden walls. Rocco sat quietly beside the window, wrapped carefully in his cozy scarf. Between his little paws, he held a tiny cup of warm berry tea. Rocco loved rainy nights like this. They made the whole forest feel slow, soft, and sleepy. For a long while, he simply watched the rain slide gently down the glass window. Outside, small fireflies glowed softly between the trees. The whole forest felt peaceful tonight, safe, quiet, cozy. Then suddenly, Rocco heard a tiny sound somewhere outside. Tap, tap, tap. Rocco blinked slowly. The sound was very soft, almost hidden beneath the rain. Carefully, he climbed down from his chair and padded softly across the wooden floor. Near the window, standing quietly beneath the rain, was a very small raccoon. Its tiny fur was completely soaked. Little drops of water slipped softly from its ears, and the small lantern it carried no longer glowed. For a tiny moment, the little raccoon looked nervous, cold, alone. Rocco's little ears lowered softly. "Oh," he whispered quietly. Outside, cold rain continued falling through the dark forest. The wind moved softly between the tall pine trees, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled gently across the mountains. Slowly, Rocco placed one paw on the tiny wooden door handle and gently opened the cabin door. Warm golden light spilled softly into the rainy night. The little raccoon looked up quietly. Behind Rocco, the fire crackled peacefully beside the glowing lantern light. Everything inside looked warm, safe, cozy. For a tiny moment, neither of them said a word. The rain continued falling softly around them. Then carefully, Rocco wrapped half of his scarf gently around the tiny raccoon. The scarf felt warm, soft, comfortable. For the very first time that night, the little raccoon smiled. Together, they stepped slowly inside the cabin. The wooden door closed softly behind them. Outside, the rain continued falling peacefully through the dark forest. Inside, the fireplace glowed warmly beside them. Rocco carefully poured a tiny cup of warm berry tea for his new friend. Steam curled softly into the air, while both of them listened quietly to the peaceful sound of rain against the windows. Near the fireplace, the little raccoon's lantern suddenly flickered, once, then twice, and slowly, a tiny golden light began glowing once again. The little raccoon watched the lantern carefully, its eyes filled with wonder. Rocco smiled softly beside the fire. For a very long while, neither of them said anything at all. They simply listened to the peaceful sound of rain tapping gently against the cabin windows, while the warm fire danced quietly beside them. Outside, the sleepy forest swayed softly beneath the moonlight. Little fireflies floated silently through the misty trees, and somewhere deep in the rainy night, two tiny new friends slowly drifted off to sleep. Warm, safe, cozy. Far beyond the quiet pine forest, where the river moved slowly beneath the moonlight, Noru and Rocco were preparing for a very special night. Inside the little wooden cabin, everything felt warm and peaceful. The fire crackled softly in the chimney, while tiny golden lights danced across the wooden walls. Rocco hurried excitedly from one side of the room to the other, carrying blankets, snacks, and far too many fishing supplies. Noru smiled quietly. Outside, the forest river waited silently beneath the stars. The tiny wooden boat rocked gently beside the shore. Moonlight shimmered softly across the river, like silver floating over glass. Rocco carefully climbed into the boat first, holding the lantern tightly in his little paws. Then Noru untied the rope, pushed the boat away from the dock, and together, they drifted slowly into the quiet night. The river carried them gently between the dark pine trees. No wind, no noise, only the soft sound of water and the tiny creak of the wooden boat. Above them, thousands of stars filled the sky. Rocco looked upward with wide, sleepy eyes. He had never seen the forest so peaceful before. Rocco leaned carefully over the side of the boat, waiting very patiently for a fish to bite. But every time he felt something move, he became too excited and splashed the water by accident. Tiny ripples spread across the glowing river. Noru tried very hard not to laugh, but soon, both of them were giggling quietly beneath the moonlight. Slowly, a soft silver mist began to appear above the water. The forest grew quieter. Even the river seemed to slow down. Rocco held the lantern closer now. Far away, an owl called softly through the trees. The little boat drifted deeper into the glowing fog. Then suddenly, Rocco noticed something shining above the river. Tiny golden lights. One, then two, then hundreds. Fireflies. They floated gently through the mist, like tiny stars dancing in the air. The entire river began glowing softly around them. Neither Noru nor Rocco said a word. They simply watched quietly, while the magical lights surrounded the little boat. After a long, peaceful while, Noru gently turned the little boat toward home. Rocco sat quietly beneath a warm blanket, holding one tiny fish proudly in his paws. The lantern glowed softly beside him. Behind them, the river continued sparkling beneath the stars. Back inside the cabin, the fireplace crackled warmly once again. Rain had started falling softly outside. Rocco slowly sipped warm soup beside the fire, while Noru placed the little fish carefully onto the kitchen table. The forest outside was dark and sleepy, but inside the cabin, everything felt safe. Everything felt warm. And as the rain continued tapping gently against the windows, Noru and Rocco slowly closed their eyes, dreaming of rivers, stars, and floating golden lights. One peaceful evening, as the golden sunlight slowly disappeared behind the tall pine trees, Noru and Rocco decided to take a quiet walk through the forest. The air smelled of moss, wood, and fresh evening rain. Tiny leaves drifted softly through the wind, while warm orange light shimmered between the trees. Rocco happily skipped ahead along the little forest trail, carrying a small lantern beside him. Noru followed slowly behind, listening quietly to the sounds of the sleepy forest. Somewhere nearby, A river moved gently through the woods. Birds sang softly in the distance, and high above the trees, the sky slowly turned golden and pink. After walking for a while, Rocco suddenly stopped. Near the roots of an old tree, hidden beneath thick green moss, was a tiny path neither of them had ever seen before. Small glowing flowers grew quietly beside the trail, and somewhere deeper within the forest, tiny golden lights flickered softly in the shadows. Rocco looked back excitedly. Noru smiled warmly. Then together, they stepped quietly onto the hidden path. The deeper they walked, the quieter the forest became. Tall trees surrounded them on every side. Soft moss covered the ground beneath their paws. Tiny glowing plants shimmered gently beside the trail, and floating lights drifted slowly through the air like sleepy stars. The whole forest felt different here, older, softer, almost magical. Then suddenly, the trees began to open around them. Rocco's eyes widened in amazement. Before them, hidden deep within the forest, was a secret mushroom grove. Enormous mushrooms stretched high into the air, their tops glowing softly beneath the evening sky. Golden mist drifted slowly across the ground. Tiny lights floated peacefully between the mushrooms. Neither Noru nor Rocco spoke for a moment. They simply stared quietly at the magical forest around them. Then, very slowly, small glowing creatures began peeking out from behind the giant mushrooms. Tiny forest spirits. Some were round and fluffy. Others glowed softly like little lanterns. One tiny spirit carefully peeked around a mushroom, watching Rocco curiously. Rocco sat down quietly in the soft moss. The tiny spirit slowly floated closer until it gently rested inside his paws. Its warm golden light shimmered softly across his little face. Noru smiled peacefully beside him. Above the grove, hundreds of fireflies danced slowly through the evening air. The entire hidden forest glowed softly beneath the growing night sky. For a long while, Noru and Rocco simply rested beneath the giant mushrooms, listening to the quiet sounds of the magical grove, the soft wind, the floating lights, the sleepy whisper of trees. Eventually, the forest began growing darker. Tiny stars slowly appeared above the treetops. Carefully, Noru and Rocco stood up once again. The tiny forest spirits waved goodbye softly from the glowing mushrooms, while Rocco carried one tiny glowing mushroom carefully inside a small basket. Then slowly, they followed the hidden path back through the darkening forest. By the time they reached home, night had fully arrived. Inside the little wooden cabin, the fireplace crackled warmly once again. Outside, the forest had become quiet and still, but inside, the tiny glowing mushrooms filled the room with soft golden light. Rocco sat sleepily beside the fire, watching the tiny lights shimmer gently across the wooden walls. Noru wrapped a warm blanket carefully around both of them, and somewhere deep within the magical forest, beneath giant glowing mushrooms and whispering trees, tiny forest spirits continued dancing softly through the night. One cold winter evening, the forest had become completely silent beneath the snow. Outside the little wooden cabin, soft snowflakes drifted slowly through the dark blue night sky. Inside, everything felt warm and peaceful. The fireplace crackled gently beside Noru's favorite chair, while golden lantern light danced softly across the wooden walls, wrapped carefully in his cozy red scarf. Noru sat quietly beside the window watching the night sky. The forest looked different tonight. Still, silent, almost sleepy. For a long while, Noru simply listened to the peaceful sound of wind moving softly through the snowy pine trees. Then suddenly, a bright light crossed the sky above the forest. A shooting star. It glowed softly as it drifted slowly through the darkness, before disappearing somewhere far beyond the trees. Noru blinked quietly. For a moment, the entire forest became still once again. But deep inside, Noru felt something strange, something warm, something gentle. Carefully, he stood up from his chair. He wrapped his scarf tightly around his neck, picked up his lantern, and stepped quietly outside into the snowy night. The cold air shimmered softly beneath the stars. Tiny snowflakes drifted through the lantern light. Step by step, Noru walked slowly deeper into the silent forest. The snow crunched softly beneath his paws. Above him, thousands of stars glowed peacefully across the sky. The deeper he walked, the quieter the forest became. Soon, even the wind disappeared. Only silence remained. Then suddenly, far ahead between the trees, Noru noticed something glowing softly beneath the snow. A tiny light, very small, very warm. Carefully, Noru knelt beside the glowing snow, and there, resting quietly beneath the frost, was a tiny little creature made of light. Its warm golden glow flickered weakly in the darkness. The tiny creature looked cold, lost, alone. Noru's eyes softened gently. Without saying a word, he carefully lifted the tiny glowing creature into his paws. Its little light trembled softly against his scarf. Very slowly, the creature looked up at him. Then quietly, it moved a little closer toward the warmth of Noru's lantern. Snow continued falling peacefully through the forest as Noru slowly carried the tiny light back home. Inside the cabin, the fireplace glowed warmly once again. Noru wrapped the tiny creature carefully inside a soft blanket beside the fire. For a long while, the little glowing creature remained very still. The warm fire crackled softly beside them. Outside, snow drifted gently against the windows. Then slowly, the tiny creature began glowing brighter once again. Soft golden light filled the little cabin. Tiny sparkles danced gently across the wooden walls. Noru smiled peacefully from his chair beside the fireplace. The tiny creature floated quietly closer to him, resting softly beside his scarf. Everything felt warm now, safe, peaceful. And as the snowy forest slept silently beneath the stars, Noru and the little falling star slowly closed their eyes beside the fire, surrounded by soft golden light. One quiet evening, thick silver fog drifted slowly through the pine forest. Outside the little wooden cabin, everything felt unusually still. The trees barely moved. The river had become silent. Even the wind seemed to be sleeping. Inside the cabin, Noru and Rocco sat quietly beside the fireplace. The warm glow of the fire danced softly across the wooden walls, while rain tapped gently against the windows. Rocco wrapped himself carefully inside a warm blanket. Then suddenly, he noticed something far away between the trees. A tiny light, very small, very warm, glowing softly through the fog. Rocco blinked slowly. Noru," he whispered quietly. Both of them stepped closer to the window. Far beyond the dark forest, hidden somewhere deep within the mist, a tiny golden light flickered softly in the distance. But there was something strange about it. No one lived that far into the forest. At least, that was what everyone believed. For a long moment, Noru and Rocco simply watched the mysterious light through the fog. Then quietly, they put on their scarves, lit their lantern, and stepped outside into the sleepy forest. The fog curled gently between the pine trees. Tiny drops of mist shimmered softly in the lantern glow. The deeper they walked, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no river sounds, only the soft crunch of moss beneath their paws. Far ahead, the tiny light continued glowing through the darkness. Eventually, the trees slowly opened around them, and there, hidden deep within the foggy forest, stood an old stone tower. Tall, silent, covered in moss and climbing vines, near the very top. One tiny glowing window flickered warmly in the night. Rocco's eyes widened softly. The tower looked ancient, almost forgotten. Carefully, Noru pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside smelled of old books, dust, and candle wax. A narrow spiral staircase disappeared upward into the darkness. Slowly, the two friends climbed the old wooden stairs. Their lantern light danced softly across the stone walls. Above them, they could hear strange little sounds, tiny footsteps, paper moving, the soft clink of glass. Rocco held the lantern a little tighter, step by step. They climbed higher and higher through the old tower. Then finally, they reached the very top. The room above glowed warmly beneath hundreds of tiny candles. Shelves filled with ancient books covered the walls. Star maps hung beside old wooden clocks, and near a giant telescope beside the window stood a very old owl. The owl wore long, cozy robes covered in tiny golden stars. For a moment, everyone stood silently. Then the old owl smiled kindly. "Oh," he said softly, "visitors." His voice sounded warm and sleepy like the forest itself. The old owl carefully welcomed Noru and Rocco inside. Together, they sat beside the telescope while the candles flickered gently around them. Outside the tower window, the fog slowly drifted across the sleeping forest. One by one, the owl pointed toward glowing stars high above the clouds. He showed them tiny constellations, old sky maps, and beautiful lanterns shaped like stars. Rocco listened quietly with wide, sleepy eyes. Noru smiled peacefully beside him. For a long while, the three of them simply watched the stars together in silence. Eventually, the old owl reached into a small wooden drawer. Inside rested a tiny glowing lantern shaped like a little star. Its warm golden light shimmered softly across the room. Carefully, the owl placed the lantern into Rocco's paws. "So you may always find your way through the fog," he whispered gently. Outside, the night had grown even quieter. Soon, it was time to leave. Noru and Rocco slowly climbed back down the tower stairs, carrying the tiny glowing star lantern carefully beside them. Far above, the old owl waved softly from the tower window. Then slowly, the two friends disappeared once again into the sleepy, foggy forest. And long after they had returned safely home, far beyond the pine trees, the tiny light in the old tower continued glowing softly through the mist. One calm, moonlit evening, Noru and Rocco stood quietly beside the forest hills watching the night sky. The stars shimmered softly above the pine trees, while silver moonlight covered the world in a peaceful glow. Far away, beyond the dark forest, something unusual caught Rocco's eye. High upon the mountains, an ancient castle stood silently beneath the moonlight. Tiny warm lights flickered softly through a few tall windows. Rocco blinked slowly. "I thought nobody lived there," he whispered quietly. Noru watched the distant castle carefully. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Then softly, Rocco smiled, and together, the two friends lit their lantern, wrapped their scarves tightly around themselves, and began walking toward the mountains. The forest path climbed slowly higher through the trees. Soft wind moved gently through the pines. Tiny glowing particles drifted through the cool night air. Far above them, the castle continued glowing quietly beneath the stars. The closer they walked, the larger the castle became. Tall stone towers rose above the forest. Old ivy climbed slowly across the ancient walls. Moonlight shimmered softly against enormous windows made of colored glass. Everything felt silent, forgotten, almost magical. Eventually, Noru carefully pushed open the giant wooden castle door. The old hinges creaked softly through the darkness. Inside, a huge, empty hall stretched before them. Long staircases curled upward into shadows. Ancient paintings covered the walls. Candles flickered quietly beside old wooden tables. Tiny particles of glowing dust floated peacefully through the warm lantern light. Rocco's eyes widened in amazement. The castle felt old, but somehow still alive. Then suddenly, small floating lights began drifting slowly through the hallway. One, then two, then many more. The glowing lights moved gently upward toward the higher floors of the castle. Quietly, Noru and Rocco followed them. Step by step, they climbed old spiral staircases, walked through silent corridors, and past endless shelves filled with ancient books. Eventually, the floating lights led them into a beautiful round library beneath the tallest tower. And there, hovering gently above an old wooden table, was a tiny fairy. Its soft golden wings shimmered peacefully in the candlelight. For a moment, the little fairy simply watched them quietly. Then slowly, it smiled. "Welcome," the fairy whispered softly. Its tiny voice sounded light and warm like wind through leaves. The fairy floated carefully through the air before opening a small wooden box resting beside the bookshelves. Inside rested a glowing silver key. The little fairy gently placed the key into Noru's paws. "There is something hidden inside this castle," the fairy explained softly. "Something that only kind hearts may open." Rocco held the lantern closer now, together. The two friends followed the fairy deeper into the castle tower. Higher and higher they climbed, until finally, they reached a forgotten stone room beneath the tallest roof of the castle. Moonlight poured softly through the broken tower windows, and there, resting quietly beneath the silver light, stood an ancient wooden chest. Dust shimmered softly around it. The chest looked older than anything they had ever seen before. Carefully, Noru placed the silver key into the lock. The old chest opened slowly with a soft wooden creak. Then suddenly, warm golden light filled the tower. Tiny glowing stars floated gently upward into the air. Little constellations shimmered softly around the room. Golden lights drifted peacefully through the darkness like pieces of the night sky itself. Rocco stared upward in silent wonder. The entire tower glowed with warm, magical light. For a long while, Noru and Rocco simply watched the floating stars together beneath the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful, quiet, infinite. Eventually, the tiny lights slowly drifted back into the ancient chest once again. The fairy smiled softly beside them. Outside, the forest had become completely silent beneath the stars. Soon, it was time to leave. Noru and Rocco carefully made their way back down through the sleeping castle halls, carrying the warm silver key safely inside their lantern bag. And long after the two friends had disappeared back into the forest, far above the mountains, the ancient moonlit castle continued glowing softly beneath the endless night sky. One quiet autumn evening, as soft rain drifted gently across the forest hills, Noru and Rocco noticed something glowing far beyond the trees. In the distance, beneath the darkening sky, an enormous city shimmered softly with golden lights. Hundreds of lanterns glowed beside quiet canals. Warm lights flickered through old windows. Tall rooftops disappeared gently into the evening fog. Rocco's eyes widened softly. "It looks magical," he whispered. For a long moment, both friends simply watched the distant city glowing beneath the rain. Then quietly, they packed a small travel bag, wrapped themselves in warm scarves, and followed the old railway path leading toward the lights. As night slowly arrived, the city grew larger before them. Cobblestone streets shimmered beneath golden lanterns. Rain tapped softly against old rooftops. Vintage trams rolled slowly through the sleepy streets. Everything felt peaceful, warm, dreamlike. Noru and Rocco wandered quietly through the lantern city together. They crossed old stone bridges above calm canals, while golden reflections danced across the dark water below. Tiny cafes glowed softly beside narrow alleyways. Music drifted gently from distant windows. Somewhere nearby, a clock tower quietly chimed through the fog. The entire city felt alive, but somehow still sleepy. Eventually, they noticed a tiny old bookshop hidden between two narrow streets. Warm candlelight glowed behind the rainy windows. Inside, shelves filled with ancient books stretched toward the ceiling. An elderly fox quietly smiled from behind the wooden counter. Without saying very much, the old fox carefully unrolled a strange glowing map across the table. Tiny lantern symbols shimmered softly across the paper. Rocco leaned closer curiously. The map showed hidden paths winding quietly through the old city. And at the very top, far above the rooftops, one tiny glowing lantern blinked softly beside a forgotten tower. The old fox smiled gently. "Not every place in this city appears on ordinary maps," he whispered quietly. Outside, the rain continued falling softly across the lantern streets. Soon, Noru and Rocco found themselves following tiny glowing lantern lights deeper into the old city, through hidden alleyways, across quiet staircases, and beneath ivy-covered arches glowing softly in the rain. The higher they climbed, the quieter the city became. Far below, golden lights shimmered peacefully through the fog. Eventually, they reached a hidden rooftop garden high above the sleeping city. Tiny glowing plants swayed gently beside warm lanterns. Rain shimmered softly across old stone paths, and all around them, the lantern city stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. For a long while, Noru and Rocco simply sat quietly together watching the glowing city below. No noise, no hurry, only rain, warm lantern light, and the peaceful sound of distant trams moving slowly through the streets. Everything felt calm here, safe, almost magical. Much later that night, the two friends slowly boarded the final train home. Wrapped carefully in warm blankets beside the window, they watched the golden lantern city disappear softly into the rainy darkness behind them. And long after the train had vanished into the sleeping forest, thousands of tiny lanterns continued glowing peacefully through the foggy autumn night. One cold and quiet evening, as rain drifted softly through the sleeping forest, Noru and Rocco discovered something unusual hidden between the pine trees. Old train tracks, covered in moss, silent beneath the fog. Curious. The two friends followed the forgotten railway deeper into the forest. The air smelled of rain, wood, and cold mountain wind. Far ahead, a warm golden glow flickered softly through the mist. Step by step, Noru and Rocco slowly arrived at a tiny abandoned train station. Old lanterns glowed quietly beside the wooden platform. Soft fog curled gently around the empty tracks. And above the station door, an ancient clock ticked slowly toward midnight. Rocco looked around in wonder. The station felt forgotten, almost frozen in time. For a long while, nothing happened at all. Only rain tapping softly against the roof. Only the quiet sound of wind moving through the trees. Then suddenly, far away through the fog, a soft whistle echoed through the night. Rocco's ears lifted slowly. A warm light appeared between the trees, growing brighter, closer, until finally, an enormous old train emerged from the silver mist. Warm lantern light glowed through its windows. Soft steam drifted upward into the cold night sky. The train moved slowly, peacefully, almost silently along the tracks. Neither Noru nor Rocco spoke. The magical train stopped gently beside the platform. Its wooden doors opened with a quiet creak. Warm golden light spilled softly into the rainy forest. Carefully, the two friends stepped inside. The train felt warm and sleepy. Old lanterns swayed gently above polished wooden seats. Tiny cups of tea rested quietly beside the windows. Soft music drifted faintly through the wagons. All around them, peaceful passengers traveled silently through the night. A fox quietly read a book beneath the lantern glow. A sleepy owl rested beside the window. A squirrel wrapped in a scarf watched snow falling outside. Everything felt calm here, safe, like a dream. Slowly, the train began moving once again. Outside the windows, the forest drifted quietly past beneath the rain. Soon, the dark trees disappeared beneath snowy mountains glowing softly in the moonlight. Frozen lakes shimmered like silver glass. Tiny villages slept peacefully beneath warm lights. Rocco pressed his paws gently against the window in amazement. Farther ahead, an endless bridge stretched across dark water beneath thousands of stars. The train crossed slowly above the shimmering night below. Inside the wagon, everything remained peaceful and warm. Eventually, Noru and Rocco discovered a small dining carriage glowing softly with lantern light. There, They sat quietly together, drinking warm hot chocolate beside the rainy windows. Outside, snow drifted gently through the sleeping world. Time itself seemed slower aboard the midnight train. Much later that night, a tall owl wearing an elegant old conductor uniform approached quietly through the wagon. The owl smiled kindly beneath the lantern glow. Without saying very much, the conductor carefully placed 2 tiny glowing tickets onto the table. Golden words shimmered softly across the paper. For those who need a quiet place to dream. Rocco read the words slowly, then looked quietly toward Noru. For a long while, the 2 friends simply listened to the peaceful sound of wheels rolling softly along the tracks. Eventually, the train began slowing down once again. Outside, early morning fog drifted gently through the forest. The magical train returned silently to the tiny forgotten station. Noru and Rocco stepped quietly back onto the wooden platform. The conductor tipped his hat softly from the doorway. Then slowly, the old train disappeared once again into the silver mist. The warm lantern lights faded farther and farther into the forest, until only silence remained. And by the time the morning sun began rising through the trees, the forgotten station had disappeared completely beneath the fog, as though it had never been there at all. One peaceful night, while silver clouds drifted slowly above the northern mountains, Noru and Rocco discovered something hidden high above the forest. Old lantern lights, far away in the fog. Curious, the 2 friends followed the narrow mountain trail beneath the moonlight. Cold wind moved softly through the pine trees. Tiny stars shimmered above the clouds, and somewhere high in the distance, a warm golden glow flickered quietly through the mist. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. Eventually, the trees slowly disappeared behind them, and there, hidden among the sleeping mountains, stood a forgotten little airfield. Soft lanterns glowed beside an old wooden hangar. Tiny lights reflected across the wet stone ground, and resting silently beneath the enormous moon stood a beautiful old airplane. Its silver wings shimmered softly beneath the night sky. Small lanterns glowed warmly beside the propellers. Steam drifted gently through the cold mountain air. Rocco's eyes widened in amazement. "It looks magical," he whispered softly. Then suddenly, the wooden hangar door creaked open. An old fox slowly stepped outside, wearing a long pilot coat and a warm wool scarf. Tiny golden stars were stitched carefully across his gloves. For a moment, the old aviator simply smiled quietly beneath the lantern light. "You arrived just in time," he said softly. His voice sounded warm and calm like the mountains themselves. "The moonlight flight is about to begin." Carefully, Noru and Rocco climbed aboard the old airplane. Inside, the cabin felt warm and peaceful. Lanterns swayed softly beside polished wooden walls. Tiny glowing instruments flickered gently in the darkness. Blankets rested neatly across cozy seats beside the windows. Outside, the propellers slowly began turning. The airplane rolled gently across the foggy mountain runway. Then slowly, peacefully, it lifted into the night sky. Below them, The mountains disappeared beneath endless clouds. The world became quiet, weightless, dreamlike. Noru pressed softly against the window. Far beneath the airplane, tiny forests slept peacefully in the darkness. Frozen rivers shimmered silver beneath the moonlight. Little towns glowed softly like scattered stars, higher and higher. The airplane floated through the sleeping sky. Soon, beautiful northern lights began dancing slowly above the clouds. Soft green light shimmered gently across the airplane wings. Rocco stared upward silently in wonder. The entire sky glowed like magic. Inside the cabin, the old fox carefully prepared warm cocoa beside a tiny lantern stove. Steam curled softly into the warm air. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly across the windows. For a long while, Noru and Rocco simply sat quietly together beneath blankets, watching the endless stars beyond the clouds. Everything felt peaceful here, safe, infinite. Then slowly, the clouds began to clear, and suddenly, the enormous moon appeared beside them, closer than either of them had ever imagined. Its silver light filled the entire sky. Tiny stars shimmered softly around the airplane wings. For one quiet moment, it felt as though they were floating through a dream. Far below, the whole world slept peacefully beneath the clouds. Eventually, soft golden colors slowly began appearing along the horizon. Morning was coming. The airplane turned gently back toward the mountains. Below them, fog drifted peacefully through the valleys once again. Soon, the old airfield appeared quietly through the morning mist. The airplane landed softly beside the lanterns. Outside, the first birds of dawn began singing through the mountains. The old aviator fox smiled warmly beside the glowing airplane. "Not every journey needs a destination," he whispered gently. "Sometimes the sky itself is enough." Noru and Rocco thanked the old pilot quietly. Then slowly, they followed the mountain path back toward the sleeping forest. And much later that morning, as sunlight warmed the little wooden cabin, the two friends sat quietly outside, watching the final stars disappear from the pale blue sky, remembering the magical moonlight flight far above the clouds. One unusually quiet night, something strange began happening above the northern forest. The stars were disappearing. One by one, tiny lights slowly faded from the sky. Outside the little wooden cabin, Noru and Rocco sat quietly beside their lantern, watching the darkening heavens above the trees. At first, the change felt almost impossible to notice. But slowly, the night became emptier, darker. Even the fireflies drifting softly through the forest began glowing less brightly than before. The whole world felt strangely still. Rocco looked upward nervously. "There are fewer stars tonight," he whispered softly. Cold wind drifted gently through the pine trees. Then suddenly, far away between the snowy forest shadows, a soft white glow appeared. A small white deer stood silently beneath the trees. Snow shimmered softly across its glowing fur. Its silver eyes reflected the fading sky above them. For a long moment, the mysterious deer simply looked quietly toward the mountains. Then slowly, it disappeared deeper into the snowy forest. Noru picked up the lantern carefully. Without saying very much, the two friends wrapped themselves in warm scarves. and followed the silent, glowing tracks through the snow. The deeper they traveled, the darker the sky became. Soon, only a handful of stars remained above the mountains. Cold wind whispered softly across frozen rivers and snowy trees. Far ahead, warm candlelight suddenly glowed through the storm, high within the mountains. The old owl astronomer waited quietly inside his observatory cabin. Ancient star maps covered the walls. Candles flickered softly beside enormous books filled with constellations. The old owl looked troubled beneath the lantern glow. "The sky is losing its light," he whispered gently, carefully. The owl opened an enormous ancient book resting beside the telescope. Inside, one final glowing page shimmered softly in the darkness. At the center of the illustration stood a forgotten observatory hidden deep within the northern mountains. "The last starlight still sleeps there," the owl explained quietly. Outside, snow continued falling softly through the silent night. Then suddenly, far below the mountains, a familiar whistle echoed gently through the valley. Warm lantern lights appeared between the snow and fog. The midnight train had returned. Soon, Noru and Rocco sat quietly inside the warm, glowing train while snowy forests drifted silently past the windows. Everything outside felt darker now, almost empty. But inside the train, soft lanterns still glowed warmly beside tiny cups of tea and sleepy wooden tables. For a long while, nobody spoke. Eventually, the train disappeared deep into the mountains, and there, high above the snowy valleys, the ancient observatory finally appeared beneath weak northern lights. Its enormous silver dome shimmered softly against the dark sky. Inside, the observatory felt vast and silent. Huge telescopes pointed toward the empty heavens. Dust floated gently through pale candlelight, and at the center of the great observatory, inside a crystal chamber, floated one tiny golden light. The final starlight, small, warm, fragile. Noru and Rocco stepped closer quietly. The tiny light flickered softly inside the darkness. Then suddenly, beneath the observatory dome, the small white deer appeared once again. Soft silver light shimmered gently across its antlers. The tiny golden starlight slowly lifted into the air, floating peacefully toward the glowing deer. For one silent moment, everything became completely still. Then softly, the sky began glowing once again. Tiny stars slowly returned above the mountains. One by one, constellations awakened across the heavens. Far below, fireflies glowed once more through the sleeping forest. Lanterns shimmered warmly beside distant cabin windows. Frozen rivers reflected silver moonlight again. The whole world slowly filled with light. For a long while, Noru and Rocco simply stood quietly beneath the restored sky, watching endless stars shimmer peacefully above the snowy mountains. Everything felt calm again, safe, infinite. And much later that morning, as soft dawn colors slowly appeared beyond the forest, the two friends sat quietly outside their little cabin, while the small white deer rested peacefully nearby beneath the glowing stars, and warm lantern light continued shining softly beside them. One rainy evening, while soft fog drifted quietly through the northern forest. Noru noticed something strange beside the trees near his cabin. A path. One he had never seen before. Curious, Noru stepped closer beneath the rain. And there, hidden silently between enormous pine trees, stood a giant forest maze. Tall hedges covered in moss stretched endlessly into the darkness. Ancient stone arches rose quietly beneath glowing lanterns. Soft rain shimmered across narrow pathways, disappearing into the fog. The maze had never been there before. For a long moment, Noru simply stood quietly beneath the lantern glow, listening to the rain. Then carefully, he picked up his little lantern and stepped inside. The deeper he walked, the quieter the world became. Tall green walls surrounded every path. Tiny lights flickered softly through the mist. Rain tapped gently against leaves above his head. Eventually, Noru reached a tiny pond hidden deep within the maze. There, an old toad fisherman sat peacefully beneath a crooked umbrella. A warm lantern glowed beside his little wooden chair. The fisherman smiled softly without looking away from the water. "Some things arrive only when the world becomes quiet enough," he whispered gently. Noru sat beside the pond for a little while, listening to the peaceful sound of rain drifting across the water. Then quietly, he continued deeper into the maze. Soon, warm light and the smell of fresh bread drifted softly through the fog. Hidden between the hedge walls, a tiny bakery glowed warmly in the darkness. Inside, a little mouse baker carefully placed warm bread onto wooden shelves beside flickering candles. The tiny baker smiled kindly toward Noru. "Warm things are meant to be shared," she said softly. Outside, the rain continued falling peacefully through the maze. Farther ahead, Noru discovered a tiny forgotten train station hidden between ivy-covered walls. An old mole conductor stood quietly beside miniature railway tracks glowing beneath lantern light. The tiny train never seemed to arrive, but the mole simply smiled calmly. "Not every journey needs to move quickly," he whispered. Noru listened to the gentle sound of distant rain upon the tracks before continuing onward once again. The maze pathways twisted deeper beneath the night sky. Eventually, Noru reached a circular hidden library. Towering books surrounded a warm, glowing fireplace. Candles flickered softly beside enormous windows covered in rain. An old owl librarian carefully closed a dusty book. "Stories remember things long after the world forgets," the owl said quietly. Noru remained there for a while, watching dust shimmer through the warm candlelight. Later, soft violin music drifted through the foggy maze. Beneath an old stone bridge, a lonely fox violinist played quietly beside the rain. The music echoed gently through the sleeping labyrinth. For a long moment, Noru simply listened. No words were needed, only the sound of rain and the quiet melody beneath the lantern glow. Then suddenly, far ahead between the foggy pathways, a small white deer appeared silently beneath the mist. Its silver fur shimmered softly beside the glowing hedges. The mysterious deer looked toward Noru for only a moment, before disappearing once again into the rain. Quietly, Noru followed. The maze slowly opened around him, and finally, he arrived at its hidden center. Ancient trees glowed softly beneath the rainy sky. Hundreds of tiny lanterns rested silently between old stone arches. And there, an old forest lamplighter moved quietly through the darkness, carrying a long golden flame. One by one, he lit the sleeping lanterns of the maze. Warm golden light slowly spread through every pathway, through every arch, through every hidden corner of the forest labyrinth. The old lamplighter smiled gently toward Noru. "This maze appears only for those who need to remember the small lights of the world," he whispered softly. Soon, the entire forest maze glowed peacefully beneath the rain and fog. For a long while, Noru simply stood quietly beneath the warm lantern light, listening to the sleeping forest around him. Everything felt calm, safe, connected, and much later, as pale morning light slowly appeared through the trees, Noru quietly found the path leading home once again. Behind him, the glowing maze slowly disappeared into the fog beneath the rain, until only the silent forest remained once more.